All right, so today we're going to talk about the history of Christianity and go over some of the major events and movements that have occurred in Christianity's 2,000-year history. So the first individual that, of course, we need to talk about is a man named Jesus, who's oftentimes referred to as Jesus of Nazareth, because that is the area that he grew up in, the area that he lived. In which he lived, which is today known as Israel, and at the time of his life was the Roman colony of Judea. Jesus is not necessarily the founder of Christianity. We don't really use that term to talk about him in relation to the tradition because the tradition starts after his death. So the tradition that comes to be known as Christianity actually originally is referred to as the Way, and then eventually becomes known as Christianity, really doesn't start until after his death. So Christianity is a tradition that is founded on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, but Jesus himself is not someone who starts this tradition, who leads this tradition or this religion, because he's not around. He doesn't live to see that event. So just some basics about Jesus. So Jesus was a Jewish peasant. So he was living in the Roman colony of Judea, grows up as a Jewish man. And his life, his dates, are kind of easy to remember. We're going to use a very traditional dating years for his life, which is basically 1 to 30 or 0 to 30. The Western calendar, the Gregorian calendar, starts over with the birth of Jesus. So in our culture, in Western culture, which is greatly shaped by the Christian tradition, the event of Jesus' birth was seen as so momentous that the world changed. So the dating system starts over. So this is the event that divides what we call BCE, which used to be called BE, before Christ, and what is now called BCE, or traditionally was known as AD, which doesn't stand for after death. That's what a lot of people assume. It stands for Anno Domini, which means in the year of our Lord. So in the years after God had been born into the world, and we'll talk much more about Jesus' connection to God. So Jesus of Nazareth lives from about the year 0 to 1 to about the year 30. There are definitely always debates among scholars about the exact years of his birth, the exact year of his death, and they always vary maybe by about 5 years or so, but we're going to say from about the year 0 or 1 to about the year 30. So he doesn't live a very long life. He doesn't live into old age, which is very important in Christianity, his death and belief in his resurrection after death. So this individual, important to note, there's not a lot of question about whether or not Jesus actually lived within the scholarly community. We do have pretty sound historical evidence that this individual did live, and that comes mostly from mentions of Jesus in non-Christian literature. So there are several references to Jesus from writings by others in the first century who are not part of the Christian movement, and these are not complementary references. These are writings from Jews or from Romans who are actually criticizing the Christian movement, making fun of this new religious tradition, and so they're saying all of these very negative things about Christians and Christianity. So the general line of thinking is that if there was a question about whether or not Jesus actually existed, this would be one of the criticisms. This would be something that was raised by the critics of Christianity, and it's not. It's not raised as one of those criticisms. So most likely this individual really did live. We'll just go over, the basic outlines of his life, and then in myths of origin, historical myths, that's when we'll talk about the details of his life as they're recorded in the Christian sacred text. So Jesus of Nazareth, born into a Jewish family. He was a peasant, so he was not very educated, not very wealthy. At about age 30, he is baptized and he starts a teaching and preaching career. He starts going around into the small towns of Judea and giving teachings about God, teachings about ethics, and performing healings. He gains a small following during this time. People are attracted to him. They come to listen to him speak as well as be healed by him. This lasts for about 3 years. After that time, he's arrested by the Roman authorities. He is put on trial for sedition or treason, speaking against the Roman Empire, which was something that was very much persecuted at the time. He is found guilty after a brief trial, and he is executed by the Roman authorities. His execution is done in the form of a crucifixion, which was the most common form of the death penalty or death punishment at the time. So many other people were crucified as well. He was killed, he was buried, but then after his death, his followers reported seeing him alive again. So they started to believe that he had been resurrected from the dead. This very strange, series of events is what starts a questioning process by Jesus's followers. Who was this individual? What did his teaching and healings mean? What does it mean that he died, that he was killed? And what did it mean that he was resurrected? This is a very mysterious and confusing event for people at the time. And this process of questioning, this series of questioning, who is this individual? What did their life mean? What did their death mean? Eventually is coalesced into Christian doctrine. Eventually the answers to those questions, or I should say the variety of answers to those questions, are what come to be known as the Christian tradition and Christian belief. So that's why I said Jesus didn't necessarily start the Christian religion, but it is questions about his life, death, and resurrection that start the process of forming this religious tradition. So that's a little bit on this individual, and again, we'll go over much more detail about his life as they're recorded in the Christian scriptures. Okay, so after his death, the movement, which again still at this time is called the Way, it's not called Christianity, was basically a Jewish sect. It was a group of Jewish people who believed that there was something special about Jesus. Jesus's initial followers were all Jewish, right? He was a Jewish man, and he went to Jewish towns to speak to other Jews about God, about Torah law, and to perform healings among the Jewish community. So for a very long time, what came to be known as Christianity really was a movement within Judaism, right? Jesus's followers during his life and after his death started to identify him with the Jewish Messiah, right, with the Mashiach, which we talked and read about in detail in our Judaism unit. But what's interesting is that today, seeing Jesus as the Messiah and Jews disagreeing that Jesus was the Messiah is really seen as the main difference between those two religious traditions. But at the time, that wasn't that big of a deal. Around the time that Jesus lived, there was a lot of persecution of the Jewish people, and so there was a lot of hope that the Messiah would be coming soon. Right, the Messiah would come to right the wrongs that had been done to the Jewish people, to kick the Romans out of Israel and return the land to the Jewish people. And Jesus was really just one of these individuals who was identified as the Messiah. So there were lots of groups in the 1st century BCE, 1st century CE, who were identifying individuals as the Messiah. But they were not separating themselves from Judaism in general. They pretty much were staying within Judaism, but saying, I think this guy's the Messiah, but then his rebellion would be crushed. I think this guy's the Messiah, but then something bad would happen to that movement. So it wasn't necessarily saying that Jesus was the Messiah that eventually caused Judaism and Christianity to part ways. What did initiate that distinguishing feature, or the fact that they end up becoming different traditions, is really the question about whether or not people who want to follow Jesus have to follow Torah law. The first generation, or several generations of Christians, did follow Torah law. They were Jewish. Jesus' first followers were all Jewish. So they had grown up following Torah law and continued to do so. However, the Christian movement did start to grow very quickly. It became very popular very fast, and it spread rapidly throughout the Mediterranean. So more and more people who were not Jewish started to become followers of Jesus. So the question became, do non-Jews have to follow Torah law? If they see Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, they want to follow the teachings of Jesus, they want to believe in the special role of Jesus in the world, do they also have to follow Torah law? And the answer that Christianity came to was that no, that's not required anymore. So this becomes the instigating factor for these traditions to finally part ways. But it is important to know that it didn't happen right away. It took several hundred years for followers of Jesus to really fully separate themselves from the Jewish community and see themselves as members of a completely different religious tradition. It was a slow separation process. It wasn't something that happened overnight. And I mean, we know that this is the case because there are writings, there are sermons from churches that go, as late as in the 300s, where Christian ministers, Christian priests are telling their community, you guys have to stop going to synagogue on the Shabbat. You guys have to stop celebrating Passover. So clearly, for many Christians, for several hundred years, they kind of had this hybrid identity. They saw themselves as Christian and Jewish at the same time. So it just was a slower process than is oftentimes assumed. All right, then the next major event that we're going to talk about is the Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan is a legal proclamation in 313 CE that makes Christianity a legal religion in the Roman Empire. So what had been happening for the last 300 years was that Christianity was growing very quickly. It was spreading throughout the Mediterranean. However, it was illegal to be a Christian. It was against the law of the Roman Empire to be Christian. The Roman Empire had an official religion, the Roman religion, so it was expected that everyone participate in the Roman religion. Special exemptions were given to individual communities, such as the Jews. The Jews were seen as a historical religion that had a very long history, so they were given exemption to these laws. But the Christian tradition was new, right? It was a brand new religious tradition. So it was seen with a lot of skepticism. It was dismissed by many people as strange, as odd, that these people were bad, they were doing bad things. It was seen as a cult. So it was not given that type of exemption. It was against the law, and there were a variety of punishments that could happen if it was found out that you were a Christian. It kind of depended on the emperor at the time. Some emperors were very strict about this law, and they would put Christians to death. They would execute Christians if you were found out to be a Christian. Other emperors were not so harsh. There might be a fine to pay, or you might have to spend some time in prison if you were found out to be Christian. So Christianity was a secretive underground religion for the first 300 years of its existence. There was no formal institution, there was very little organization, and individual churches set up around the Mediterranean were independent, and as I said, they were conducted in secretive fashion. There were no churches, there were no external buildings, you couldn't be Christian in public, you couldn't celebrate Christian holidays in public. Christians met together in each other's homes. They would meet secretly. They would meet in the night. They would meet in a basement if that was possible, to have their worship services, celebrate holidays, things like that. So the Edict of Milan is what changed that. In 313 CE, it became legal to be a Christian in the Roman Empire. This edict was proclaimed by a very important person to the history of Christianity, which is Emperor Constantine. Emperor Constantine is the individual who not only changes Christianity from illegal to legal status in the Roman Empire, but closer to the end of his life, he makes it the official religion of the Roman Empire. So he does a lot for Christianity in terms of institutionalizing it, organizing it, and helping it to spread even further. So we'll talk a lot more about him as we go through this very important century in Christianity, the 4th century or the 300s. The reason why Constantine did this is because he eventually converts to Christianity. So he was, he's a Roman aristocrat, so he was raised in the Roman religion, but his mother converted to Christianity. So his mother ends up becoming a Christian, and she shares this with her son, even though it's illegal at the time. She shares it with her son, and she wants her son to convert to Christianity. So she talks to him about her faith, her tradition, and she eventually gets him to convert. There's a very interesting story about his conversion, which we don't have time to go into, but he does eventually convert to Christianity, and he makes these big changes in the Roman Empire towards the legal status of Christianity. So after 313 CE, it is now legal to be a Christian. You can publicly declare that you're a Christian, and Christianity starts to organize, right? For the first time, it can have buildings, they can have meetings, they can communicate with each other freely. So Christianity goes from this secret, very loosely organized underground religion to an organized, institutionalized form of the religious tradition. So that's a very important moment in the history of Christianity. The next thing, the next kind of major moment that we'll mention is an event called the Great Schism. The Great Schism happens in 1054 CE. After Christianity organizes and becomes an institution, an institutionalized religion in the 4th century with Emperor Constantine, it's important to know that there's one Christian church. There is one major Christian church that exists throughout Europe, throughout the Middle East, throughout the Mediterranean area. Other than there are a few very small churches that remain separate from the major Christian church. These are there's an Ethiopian church, there's a Syrian church, there's a Coptic church. But other than these very small communities, if you're Christian, it means you are a member of this one organization, this one religious tradition. The Great Schism is what changes that. It is the breaking up of the Christian church into Roman Catholicism in the West and the Orthodox Church in the East. So what happens at this time, or leading up to this time, is that there comes to be two different centers of power in Christianity. And those two centers, one is located in Rome, within Italy, and one is located in Constantinople, which is the old name for Istanbul in Turkey. So Rome is in the west, and Constantinople is in the east. Christianity, over the past 700 years, has become the official religious tradition of the empire. There are leadership positions, hierarchies, right? There are priests, there are bishops, there are deacons, there are all sorts of individuals at different levels. These different leadership leaders get together, they have meetings, they vote on this hierarchy, and what happens is there starts to be tension between these two centers of power. Rome has a certain way of doing things. They have certain leaders that they like. Constantinople has different ways of doing things, and they have their own leaders, and there comes to be some other differences, linguistic differences. For example, the church in Rome uses the Latin translation of the Bible, while the church in Constantinople uses the Greek translation of the Bible, and there come to be some theological differences. They come to have some differences in belief concerning Jesus and most particularly the Holy Spirit, how they understand the Holy Spirit, which we'll talk about more when we get to the Trinity. And these sort of lots of small differences eventually end up causing friction between these two centers of power. What happens in 1054 that eventually sort of forces them to completely separate from each other is they're actually voting on who's going to become the next pope, who's going to become the next leader of the Christian church, and the bishops in Rome vote their guy, the person they like, who comes from Western Europe, and the bishops from the East vote for their guy, the individual that comes from their part of Europe. So, and they can't agree. So they're supposed to come to agreement on one pope, but they refuse to agree. So each side declares that their person is pope. So there are actually two popes, and there is an argument that these two individuals are both claiming to be the pope. So what happens is the two popes excommunicate each other. Each of them says, you are not the true pope, you're excommunicated. The other one says, no, you're not the true pope, you're excommunicated. So this is what finally sort of, forces them to split ways completely. So for the next 500 years or so in Europe, if you are Christian, if you live in Western Europe, you're Catholic. If you live in Eastern Europe, you're Orthodox. And these are still the two major branches of Christianity today, Roman Catholicism and the Eastern Orthodox Church. So both of these two traditions still have millions upon millions of adherents, and it's important, it wasn't necessarily like a choice, are you Catholic or are you Orthodox? It really was just where in Europe you lived. If you lived in the western part of Europe, you ended up being Catholic. If you lived in the eastern part, you ended up being Orthodox. This was a rift that took several hundred years to overcome. It really has only been since probably the 1990s that representatives of the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church have had much greater contact with each other, have actually offered official apologies to each other for the treatment of each other over the past 1,000 years. So now the two churches are much closer together, and they do a lot of work together. But that really didn't happen for almost 1,000 years. So there were still some deep-seated resentment towards each other over this rift that happened in 1054 CE. Okay, so then the next major event, which we'll just talk very briefly about here, and then in much more detail when we get to the society dimension, is the Protestant Reformation. So, so 1054 CE, Christianity divides up into these two branches, Catholic and Orthodox. So for the next 500 years or so, if you're Christian, you're either one of those two. The Protestant Reformation changes all that. It is the event that leads to the incredible diversity of Christian denominations that we have today. Whether you have background in the Christian tradition or not, you're probably very familiar with the fact that Christianity has thousands of different denominations, right? Being Christian means you could be, not just Catholic or Orthodox, but Baptist, Methodist, Lutheran, non-denominational, evangelical. There's, and the list goes on and on and on. So the Protestant Reformation is what makes Christianity go from two different things, for the most part, two different churches, to hundreds and then thousands of different churches. So the Protestant Reformation starts with a man named Martin Luther, who is a German Catholic monk. Martin Luther comes to believe through his study, so he's a German Catholic monk, he has lived his adult life studying the Christian Bible, living a life of piety in a monastery, and he comes to believe that the Catholic Church has made a number of mistakes. They have made a number of theological mistakes. They have misunderstood what the true purpose or true essence of Christianity is, and they've also made a number of sort of practical mistakes. The Catholic Church has become a corrupt institution, and they are indulging in certain practices that are incorrect or very, very corrupt. They know that it's incorrect, but they're continuing to do it. Martin Luther writes down all of these problems. He comes up with a list of 95 things that he thinks the Catholic Church is doing wrong. As I said, some are theological, some are practical. And he takes this list and he nails it to the door on the church of his hometown in Germany, which is Wittenberg. Nailing this document on the doors of the church is basically the 16th century equivalent of posting a Facebook status. It is a very public act that everyone was going to see. So the Catholic Church does not respond well to these criticisms, and they end up excommunicating Martin Luther. They say, you're not a true Catholic, so you're kicked out of the Catholic Church. Martin Luther starts his own denomination of Christianity, which comes to be known as Lutheranism and is still a very popular branch of Protestantism today. And there's a couple aspects of what Martin Luther believes that ends up leading to the proliferation of denominations. Again, we'll talk much more about several of his issues with the Christian church, but one thing that he strongly advocated was that every Christian should read the Bible for him or herself. This was something that during his lifetime was unheard of. Most Christians had never read a single word of the Bible because it was just very, very difficult to do so. Firstly, most people were illiterate, right? This is medieval Europe. So most people didn't know how to read. They didn't have enough education to do so. The second issue was that Bibles were very expensive. Even if you could read, most people would never be able to afford a Bible. Every single Bible had to be written by hand, which took an incredibly long time to do. So buying a Bible was really the equivalent at the time of buying, like a Maserati or a mansion. It was not accessible to most people. The third issue was that in Western Europe, at least, the Bible was only available in Latin. You couldn't read it in your own language, in your local language or vernacular language. So even if some people did know how to read, they would know how to read German or Spanish or French or English, but they didn't know how to read Latin. And that was the language that the Bible was written in at that time. Not the original language, but that was the only translation that was available. So for these three reasons, most Christians had never read the Bible. What they knew about Christianity came from what the priests and bishops had taught them about Christianity. Those were the individuals who could read the Bible, right? If you were a monk, a nun, or a priest, you had education and you had access to a Bible that you could read. So Martin Luther said, no, this isn't the way it's supposed to be. Every single Christian should have an opportunity to read the Bible for themselves so that they can decide for themselves what the Christian tradition is all about and who Jesus is and what his teachings are. Luckily, right around this time is when the printing press came out, so the price of a Bible dropped dramatically, and Martin Luther advocated that the Bible should be translated into local languages. He himself personally translated the entire Bible into German, and the Luther Bible, as it's called, is still very popular in Germany today. But this idea catches fire, right? It becomes very popular, and the Bible is quickly translated into many different languages. So what happens is people do start reading the Bible for themselves. Now they can afford a Bible, and they can read the Bible in the language that they know. The Bible is a very long and complicated text. So what happens is people start reading it for themselves, and they have their own interpretation of who Jesus is, what his teachings are all about, what his life, death, and resurrection means. The same questions that the first followers of Jesus have. If I were to give you all a copy of the Bible, tell you to read it, and then write a paper on what is the essence of Christianity, you would probably all write different papers. You would have different ideas, different interpretations of what's included in this text. And that's what happens to Christianity. When people read it for themselves, they end up having different interpretations, different ideas of what this means, right? What this story means, and who this individual is. So different groups start to break away and to form their own denomination of Christianity that is true to the interpretation or understanding that they have. That process has now been happening for 500 years, and that's why we have so many different types of Christianity today, so many different denominations. So that's one of the reasons why I said we call really everything after the Protestant Reformation a Protestant group. Not that they all believe the exact same thing, but that they are the inheritors of this teaching of Martin Luther's. You should read the Bible for yourself and decide what it means for yourself. And that has led to, the hundreds and thousands of Protestant denominations that have cropped up since that time. Okay, so that's very important, and we'll talk a lot more in detail about Martin Luther, his arguments with the Catholic Church, and how that leads to a completely new form of Christianity. The very last point that I have here is just that today, Christianity is the most popular religion in the world. There are over 2 billion Christians in the world, and that number is including all forms of Christianity. So Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, and as I mentioned, some of those, there are some smaller churches that are called the ancient churches, the Coptic Church, the Ethiopian Church, the Syrian Church, but all individuals whose religious tradition centers on this individual Jesus. Almost 1 in 3 people on this planet belong to that Christian family. So it is an incredibly popular religious tradition, although scholars of religion, people who do statistics and surveys and things like that, actually say that Christianity is not growing very quickly in the world anymore, and that most likely Islam will overtake it as the most popular religion probably within our lifetimes. Most predictions say about by the year like 2050, sometime around there. So it is currently the most popular religious tradition, but its growth is slowing, and that may not last for very long. Okay, so those were some of the major historical events in Christianity, and next we'll move on to myths of origins.